It was a cold September afternoon when Lucas, a man in his early 30s, arrived home to find the place empty. His wife, Clara, was nowhere to be seen. At first he thought she had gone for a walk, as she did every afternoon. But as the hours passed and the night deepened, panic began to take hold of him. Her phone was off, and the neighbors hadn't seen anything. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew by the minute. That night, Lucas called the police, but they didn't treat the case with the urgency he expected. Clara was an adult; she could have left of her own free will. Still, he knew something didn't add up. Clara would never leave without telling him. They had been married for 5 years, and despite the ups and downs that all couples face, there was no apparent reason why she would want to leave without a word. The house was exactly as she had left it before she disappeared. Her things intact, her wallet on the counter, and a half-finished cup of tea still on the living room sideboard. In the following days, Lucas immersed himself in a frantic search. He revisited the places Clara used to frequent: cafes, parks, her work. He tried to talk to friends, family, and even distant colleagues, but no one knew anything. Time seemed to stagnate as he repeated the same questions, facing the same wall of silence. Every lead he followed ended in a dead end. The more he tried to find answers, the more he felt loneliness squeezing his heart. Weeks turned into months, and the police investigation made no progress. Lucas found himself in a constant state of waiting, as if his life was on pause. Desperation took over him, but hope never completely faded. He latched onto any glimmer of news, any phone call that might bring the answer he so desperately wanted. Memories of Clara flooded his mind. Her smile, the sound of her laugh, the way she gently touched his hand as they talked about the future. Lucas began to isolate himself. He stopped going to work, and his friends and family, although worried, could do little to get him out of that state. His home, once full of life and laughter, now seemed like a mausoleum. He barely ate, barely slept, but his phone remained by his side, hoping that at any moment a call or text would bring a response. The void left by Clara slowly consumed him. He began sleeping on the couch, unable to return to the room he shared with his wife. The bed, still made from the last time Clara was there, seemed a cruel reminder that she might never return. Every corner of the house was permeated with her presence. Her clothes in the closet, the books she left open, the small but inescapable details that made him relive her absence. But what Lucas didn't know was that his life was about to change unexpectedly. One afternoon, exactly 3 months after Clara's disappearance, Lucas was surprised by a soft knock on the door. Initially, he thought it was a delivery man or perhaps a neighbor. But when he opened the door, he found a girl he had never seen before. The girl was around 7 or 8 years old, wearing a light blue dress and holding a cardboard box with both hands. His eyes were large and curious, but his expression was too serious for a child of that age. Lucas was confused. He tried to remember if he had ever seen the girl before, but nothing about her appearance was familiar. "Can I help?" he asked, with the hoarse voice of someone who hadn't spoken to anyone in days. The girl didn't respond immediately, just lifted the box towards her. "This is for you," she said finally, in a soft, barely audible voice. Lucas looked at the box, intrigued. There was no sender, nor any indication of who had sent it. He hesitated for a moment before accepting the package. The girl remained there, standing in the doorway, watching as Lucas looked at the box cautiously. Something about her bothered him deeply. "Who gave you this?" he asked, but the girl just shrugged. "They just told me to bring it to you," she replied, before turning on her heel and running away. Lucas tried to call her back, but she was already far away. He stood still for a few seconds, watching the small figure disappear around the corner. Lucas entered the house, closing the door behind him, his heart beating fast. The box looked ordinary, but there was something about the delivery that made him uneasy. He placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a few minutes. Could it be a clue about Clara's disappearance? Or just a bizarre coincidence? His instinct told him to be careful, but curiosity and hope overcame his fear. With shaking hands, he opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a layer of old paper, was an object that Lucas never expected to see. The silver necklace that Clara wore every day. He would recognize that pendant anywhere, a piece he had given her on their 3rd wedding anniversary. Next to the necklace was a handwritten letter, which looked old and worn, as if it had been kept for a long time. The words written in the letter made Lucas' blood run cold. "She's still alive." The shock made him take a step back. His mind was spinning with 1,000 questions. Who would have sent that? How would anyone have Clara's necklace? And most importantly, what did that cryptic message mean? Fear and hope mixed in his heart. The weight of those 3 words, "She's still alive," echoed in Lucas's mind like an enigmatic, almost unreal sentence. He didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to blindly believe that the message was true, that Clara was somewhere, waiting for him. But another part feared that this was a cruel mistake, a macabre trick played by someone unknown. The feeling of not knowing who or what to trust was overwhelming. The only tangible thing there was the necklace, a symbol he recognized and that brought back memories so vivid that for a moment he could almost feel Clara nearby. Lucas took the necklace, feeling the cold silver in his hands. He remembered every detail of that piece, the soft shine of the star-shaped pendant, the sentimental meaning that he and Clara had attributed to it. The object was a direct connection to his wife, irrefutable proof that she had somehow been in the possession of whoever had sent that box. But the question persisted. How had that necklace gotten there? He thought of 1,000 possible scenarios, but none of them offered a satisfactory answer. Did the presence of that piece mean that Clara was alive? Or was it just a painful reminder of what he had lost? The letter intrigued him deeply. The aged, yellowed paper looked like it was decades old, which didn't make sense since Clara had only been missing for a few months. The words, written in an angular, difficult-to-decipher handwriting, were few but carried an immense charge. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, holding the letter carefully, as if it were a fragile piece of a larger puzzle. He read it over and over again, trying to extract any meaning other than the obvious. Who could have written that? Who knew about Clara and what had happened to her? The answers continued to elude him. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Lucas decided he couldn't stand still. He needed to act, and that meant finding the girl who had given him the box. The idea that a child was involved in this mystery deeply disturbed him, but she seemed to be the only direct link to whoever was behind the message. He left the house in a hurry, expecting to find her wandering the streets of the neighborhood. But, after hours of searching, there was no sign of her. He asked neighbors if they knew the girl, but no one seemed to know who she was. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, delivered her message, and disappeared. Tired and frustrated, Lucas returned home with more questions than answers. He felt adrift in a sea of uncertainty, not knowing what his next step would be. The initial impulse to chase clues had left him exhausted, and the lack of progress only increased his despair. He found himself once again in the place he feared so much, trapped, unable to act, and consumed by doubt. The necklace now felt like a symbol too heavy to carry, a constant reminder of how little he knew about Clara's whereabouts. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay awake, reliving the details of his wife's disappearance and the mysterious arrival of the box. The silence of the house seemed more oppressive than ever. The shadows of the trees cast by the windows created shapes he couldn't ignore. His mind was in a whirl, every little sensation magnified by the growing fear. He stood up several times, checking the doors, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment to provide more answers or, worse yet, to bring bad news. Finally, as the first light of morning began to appear on the horizon, Lucas made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. The mystery of the box and the enigmatic message had rekindled something inside him, a flame of hope, even if it was mixed with terror. He needed to find out what had happened to Clara, and if that letter told the truth, she was still alive somewhere. And Lucas was willing to do anything to get her back. The next morning, Lucas woke up with a clear mind. He could no longer wait passively for answers. The few clues he had, the necklace, the letter, and the girl's appearance, were the starting point. Each of them represented a fragment of a greater truth, something he needed to uncover. The first idea that came to mind was to look for more detailed information about the letter. Perhaps the handwriting, the type of paper, or even the ink used could reveal something useful. Although he was reluctant to trust unconventional methods, he decided to seek help from experts. Lucas's first stop was an old bookstore in the city center, a place Clara used to frequent. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Almeida, was known for his passion for ancient documents and rare manuscripts. Lucas thought that if anyone could decipher anything about the letter, it would be him. Upon entering the store, the smell of old books and the atmosphere of mystery immediately enveloped him. Mr. Almeida was at the counter, as usual, and looked up when he saw him enter. "Lucas? I haven't seen him around here in a while. Any news about Clara?" asked the old man with a compassionate look, recognizing the anguish on the man's face. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then showed the letter to Mr. Almeida, explaining the story in brief. The elderly man took the paper gently, adjusting his glasses and examining every detail with a keen eye. He turned the paper over, held it up to the light, and ran his fingers over the aged texture. "This isn't common," he muttered, after a few minutes of silence. "It looks ancient, but something tells me this has been artificially aged. Whoever wrote this wanted you to believe this message comes from the distant past." Lucas, intrigued, listened carefully. Mr. Almeida continued, "As for the handwriting, I would say that it is someone who learned to write a long time ago. They don't write like that nowadays. It is formal writing, perhaps someone older." Although it was not the shocking revelation he expected, Mr. Almeida's analysis reinforced the idea that there was something deliberately strange about the letter. Someone wanted to create an illusion of antiquity, of mystery. But what would they gain from that? Lucas thanked the bookseller and decided to move on to the next step: the box. He realized that he had not analyzed the container itself with the same attention as he had given the contents. Back at his home, he examined the cardboard box thoroughly, looking for any details that might have gone unnoticed. There were no labels, names or addresses, just a faint fingerprint on the sides. Upon closer inspection, Lucas noticed a small inscription on the bottom corner of one of the box's flaps. It was almost imperceptible, but as he ran his fingers over the surface, he felt a small relief. Using a flashlight, he was able to read the engraved letters, BP. It was a minimal clue, but a clue nonetheless. He didn't know anyone with those initials, but now he had something to look for. Feeling a little more hopeful, he decided to use the internet to see if there were any companies, organizations or places with those initials that might be involved. He spent hours browsing possible meanings for BP, from charitable organizations to small shipping companies, but nothing seemed to fit. He was about to give up when an idea occurred to him. What if BP was at a location, an abbreviation for a place Clara had mentioned at some point? He tried to remember conversations, trips, and even places she used to go. It was then that the memory of a small coastal town came to his mind. Fisherman's Bay, he muttered to himself. Clara always talked about wanting to visit that city, where her grandmother used to live when she was a child. Feeling that he had found a direction, Lucas decided to investigate more about this city. He remembered that, years ago, Clara had mentioned a possible trip there, but the plans never came to fruition. Was it possible that she had some kind of connection to this place that he didn't know about? Feeling that perhaps he was holding on to something vague, Lucas still made the decision to travel there. Something told him that the answer was in Fisherman's Bay. With new determination, Lucas packed a small backpack with the essentials and left the same day. The drive to Fisherman's Bay was long, taking nearly 6 hours to drive along winding coastal roads. But he didn't mind. As he drove, the surrounding landscape seemed to reflect his internal state. The sky filled with dark clouds, the trees swaying in the strong wind, and the sound of the sea in the distance, reverberating like a distant call. He knew that this journey might not bring him all the answers, but it was the only concrete clue he had. And with Clara's necklace still in his pocket, Lucas felt like he was closer to her than he had been in months. Upon arriving at Baía dos Pescadores, Lucas was immediately enveloped by the atmosphere of the city. It was a small, almost isolated place, with few paved streets and a population that, at first glance, seemed aged. The air smelled salty from the nearby ocean, and the sound of waves crashing against rocks echoed in the distance. He parked his car in a central square, where a small church and some local businesses made up the scene. There weren't many people on the streets, just a few fishermen returning from their daily tasks, carrying nets and boxes full of fish. Everything seemed peaceful, but Lucas knew that something deeper was waiting for him there. As he walked through the narrow streets, Lucas tried to visualize Clara there, imagining what she would have seen, what places she would have visited if, in fact, she had passed through that city. Clara's connection to Fisherman's Bay was tenuous, based on stories she had told about her grandmother's childhood. But the town seemed to maintain an aura of mystery, as if it hid secrets that had long been buried. As he passed a small cafe, he decided to go in, hoping to find someone who could give him information. The atmosphere was simple but cozy, with antique wooden tables and linen curtains that swayed gently in the sea breeze. At the counter, a middle-aged woman with gray hair tied into a loose bun greeted him with a smile. "Can I help?" she asked, as she cleaned a china cup. Lucas hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. "I'm looking for information about someone. My wife, Clara. She disappeared a few months ago, and I believe she may have passed through here," he said, not knowing exactly what to expect from the woman's reaction. Her eyes became more attentive, as if the name had triggered some distant memory. "Clara, you said? Well, I can't say for sure, but I think I heard something about a woman from out of town who stopped by a while ago. Sit down, let me ask some people I know," she replied, leaving in towards the kitchen. While waiting, Lucas couldn't help but feel nervous. "I was in a strange place, surrounded by unfamiliar people, searching for answers that seemed increasingly uncertain." A few minutes later, the woman returned with a robust-looking man, unshaven and wearing fisherman's clothes. "This is Antonio. He usually stays at the port." "He may have seen something," explained the woman, while the man sat in the chair in front of Lucas. "So, you're looking for your wife, Clara, right?" the man asked, frowning as he tried to recall the memory. Lucas nodded, and the man continued, "Now that you mention it, I remember a woman who showed up here a few months ago. She didn't say much, but she seemed worried, like she was running away from something. She arrived in a taxi, stayed in the city's hotel for one night, and then disappeared. No one has seen her since." Antonio's words made Lucas' heart race. Would it be possible that Clara was really in that city, so close and yet so far away? He had to find out more. "Do you remember any other details? Where could she have gone?" Lucas asked, his voice shaking with the mixture of anxiety and hope. Antonio shook his head. "I'm sorry, friend. After that night, no one saw her again. But I know she asked about a specific place before she disappeared. Something about an old house in the hills, a place that almost no one goes to anymore. They say it's haunted, or that keeps family secrets. But you know how these small-town stories are. They're not always founded," he explained, scratching his beard. The mention of the house in the hills intrigued Lucas. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but he knew that isolated places could, in fact, hide secrets. If Clara had asked about that house, perhaps that was where he would find some clue. Thanking the fisherman and the woman from the cafe, Lucas left towards the city hotel, where his wife had supposedly stayed. The place was small, with just 2 floors and a reception that looked like it had been set up decades ago. The woman behind the counter, a tired-looking lady, confirmed that a woman matching Clara's description had passed by, but she didn't remember many details beyond that. It was as if Clara had been a shadow, moving discreetly through the city before disappearing. Back on the streets of Pescadores Bay, Lucas stopped for a moment to observe the hills in the distance. The overcast sky looked almost ominous, and the trees swayed violently in the wind. The house Antonio had mentioned seemed like the only solid lead he had so far. Having decided to follow this path, Lucas knew that, once there, he could be closer to discovering the truth about Clara's whereabouts. But something inside him also told him that when he climbed that hill, he would face more than just the loneliness of an empty house. The afternoon was already beginning to turn into night when Lucas decided to follow Antonio's advice and go to the house in the hills. He had asked a few people around town, but most of their responses ranged from reluctance to disinterest. The inhabitants of Fisherman's Bay didn't talk much about that place, except in whispers that mentioned ancient tragedies, superstitions, and stories that were lost in the mists of time. Lucas, however, was not willing to give up. If Clara had asked about that house, then perhaps she had some connection to his disappearance. With that thought, he got in the car and drove towards the hills. The path was steep and wound through the mountains that surrounded the small town. At each turn, the vegetation became denser, and the sound of the ocean became more distant, replaced by the unsettling silence of nature. The dirt road was narrow and poorly maintained, making progress difficult, but Lucas continued forward, determined. As he drove, his thoughts revolved around the last time he had seen Clara. He remembered the little things that, at the time, seemed insignificant. The distant glances she cast out the window, the conversations that stopped mid-sentence, as if her mind was somewhere else. Could it all be connected to her disappearance? When Lucas finally saw the house, the sun was almost setting, dyeing the sky a deep orange. The building was old, large, and imposing, with stone walls that looked like they had been built centuries ago. The house sat atop an isolated hill, surrounded by tall, gnarled trees, whose shadows seemed to reach out like long arms toward them. Although it was partially deteriorated, with broken windows and missing tiles from the ceiling, there was something majestic and, at the same time, oppressive about the sight. Lucas felt a chill down his spine, but he forced himself to continue. If Clara had been there, he needed to know. He parked the car a few meters away and got out, feeling the damp earth beneath his feet. The wind was blowing hard, and the trees swayed almost ominously around the house. Lucas walked up the front steps cautiously, the sound of each step echoing in the absolute silence of the place. The wooden door was ajar, creaking softly as he approached. For a brief moment he hesitated. His heart was beating fast, and a part of his mind was warning him that something wasn't right, that he should back off. But he couldn't. He was just one step away from finding out what had happened to Clara. Lucas pushed the door and entered the house. The interior was gloomy, with only a few rays of light filtering through the broken windows. The air was heavy, smelling of mold and rotting wood. He walked slowly, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom, while his ears picked up every tiny sound. The wind whistling through the cracks, the distant creak of a loose board. The main lobby was large, with stairs that led to the upper floor and several doors that opened to other rooms. Everything seemed to have been abandoned a long time ago, but Lucas felt he was not alone. Something about that house exuded a strange, almost living presence. He began exploring the rooms one by one, trying to find any sign that Clara had been there. The first room he found looked like a library, with empty shelves and furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center, an old armchair faced an unlit fireplace. The scene was bleak, but Lucas found nothing useful. He continued exploring the house, passing through a destroyed kitchen, dark corridors, and rooms full of dust. Everything there seemed to be frozen in time, as if the house had been suddenly abandoned, leaving behind only the echo of past lives. It was when he walked up the stairs that something started to change. As he advanced through the second-floor hallway, Lucas felt a stronger, almost palpable presence. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the sound of his own footsteps became muffled, as if the environment was distorting around him. He finally stopped in front of a door at the end of the corridor, which was ajar, revealing a faint shadow of what appeared to be a bedroom. With his heart racing, he pushed the door and entered. The room was small, but appeared to have been recently inhabited. Unlike the other rooms, there was no dust there. In the center of the room, a bed was covered with a clean sheet, and on a table near the window, there was an open suitcase with clothes and objects scattered around it. The familiar smell of lavender perfume hit Lucas hard, and he recognized it immediately. It was Clara's perfume. She had been there. The shock hit him with such force that he could barely move. His eyes fixed on a photo on the table. It was a photo of him and Clara, taken on a trip they had taken years before. He took the image with shaking hands, not knowing what to think. Lucas felt like he was close to something big. something that could finally answer all the questions that had been plaguing him for months. But at the same time, he also had the feeling that, upon discovering the truth, his life would never be the same. Lucas remained static, Clara's perfume still permeating the air around him. He knew she had been there recently. The room looked like it had been used not long ago. The open suitcase, the neatly folded clothes, and the familiar touch of small personal items scattered around the room left him with a lump in his throat. As he paced back and forth, he tried to process what his discovery meant. His mind was in chaos, feeling relief and fear at the same time. Clara was alive, or at least she had been alive when she was in that house. But why had she disappeared without a trace? Why was she hidden or perhaps trapped in such a remote and strange place like that? His presence there raised more questions than answers, and the mystery seemed to grow even thicker. That small room had a distinct energy, something that Lucas couldn't explain, but that kept him on alert. He began to search the room in search of something more concrete, something that would reveal more about his wife's whereabouts. Next to the suitcase, there was a small wooden table, and on it, Lucas found a brown-covered notebook. When he opened the pages, his heart jumped. It was Clara's handwriting. She had written about events he was unaware of, mentioned encounters with strange people, and a name Lucas had never heard of before. Marcos. The name appeared several times throughout the pages, always linked to conversations and encounters full of tension. Clara was involved in something big, and that man, Marcos, seemed to be at the center of it all. As he read Clara's notes, Lucas realized that she was investigating something. The last few weeks of his life before he disappeared were filled with secret activities. There were detailed descriptions of meetings with this guy Marcos, and notes about the house in the hills. Clara seemed suspicious of everything and everyone, as if she were being followed or observed. Her writing, normally calm and organized, became increasingly disorganized as the pages progressed, reflecting a growing desperation. "They know everything," said one of the last pages. "I'm being watched. I can't trust anyone." Those words froze Lucas. What had Clara discovered? Who were they? The name of the city, Baía dos Pescadores, appeared frequently on the last pages, but there was something else that caught his attention. The repetition of the acronym BP, the same one that Lucas had found engraved on the box given by the girl. He now knew that this was not a coincidence. Clara had mentioned that someone from BP was connected to the house, and that the town was involved in something dark. As he flipped through the last few pages, Lucas found an entry that left him breathless. "If anything happens to me, look for the house. Everything will be revealed there." Clara knew something was about to happen, and that house was the key to everything. But what exactly was hidden there, waiting to be discovered? The silence that enveloped the house now seemed heavier, almost suffocating. Lucas realized that the danger Clara mentioned was closer than ever. He looked around the room, feeling a presence, an invisible tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. As he got up from the chair, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible door in the corner of the room, behind the curtain. The door was slightly open, revealing a dark and narrow space. Lucas felt his blood run cold. Without thinking much, he slowly opened the door, revealing a staircase that led down to a basement. The musty smell and the muffled sound of footsteps coming from outside made him alert. Everything seemed to converge on that basement, and he knew he needed to go down. Descending carefully, Lucas lit the way with his cell phone, feeling each step creak beneath his feet. The basement was cold and damp, with ancient stone walls, and in the center was a table covered in papers. Approaching, he noticed that the papers were old documents, letters, and photographs. One of the photos caught his attention immediately. It was a photo of Clara, taken from afar as if she were being followed. She was looking at something, or someone, outside the frame. Lucas felt his stomach turn. She knew she was being watched. Next to the photo were old letters with the initials BP at the top, and mentions of the organization that seemed to be behind it all. Clara had discovered something too dangerous to remain silent. With his heart racing, Lucas realized he was close to something huge. He was at the epicenter of a mystery much bigger than he imagined. Clara's photo, the letters, the documents, everything pointed to a plot that involved more than just her disappearance. Now, more than ever, he knew he was being watched just like Clara. The feeling of being watched was real. What he discovered there, in that basement, would forever change the course of his life and, perhaps, lead him closer to Clara or something even more dangerous. As he left the basement, Lucas was overcome by a sense of urgency. Something inside him said that the faster he acted, the greater his chances of finding Clara would be. He quickly climbed the stairs, his heart beating fast, and returned to the room where he had found the suitcase. Now that he knew Clara was being watched, he felt watched at every moment. The strong wind outside seemed to have intensified, as if nature itself was reacting to the weight of the revelations he had unearthed. When he reached the entrance of the house, he stopped for a moment to catch his breath and think about his next step. If Clara mentioned that everything would be revealed in that house, there could still be more hidden things. As Lucas pondered what to do next, he heard a sound from outside, light footsteps on wet earth. He froze for a second, his senses immediately alert. I was no longer alone in that house. Cautiously, he hid behind the door, his mind racing with possible scenarios. Could it be someone from the BP organization? An ally of Marcos? Or maybe even Clara? Fear and hope mixed in his mind, and the tension made every second seem like an eternity. The footsteps approached the entrance of the house, and the door creaked slowly as it was pushed. Lucas took a deep breath and prepared himself for whatever came next. A figure walked through the door, and Lucas felt a wave of relief and disbelief as he recognized who stood before him. It was the girl who had given him the cardboard box. She was exactly as he remembered. Small, with a light blue dress and a look that was too serious for a child her age. "You? What are you doing here?" Lucas asked, his voice coming out louder than he intended. The girl, without being scared, looked directly at him. There was something in her eyes, a deep and ancient understanding, that made him feel that this child knew much more than he let on. She stepped forward, taking a small envelope from her dress pocket and holding it out to him. Lucas took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a short letter, written in a different handwriting than the one he had encountered before. The words were simple, but loaded with meaning. "If you want to save Clara, you need to trust the girl." He looked at the child with a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. Why was that girl involved in something so dangerous? And who had written that new letter? Before he could ask any more questions, she turned and started walking towards the door. "Wait," Lucas called, but she just looked over her shoulder and said, "Come with me. We don't have much time." With no other choice, Lucas followed her, still trying to process what was happening. Night had completely fallen, and the path leading down into the hills was now lit only by the faint light of the moon and stars. The girl walked quickly, despite her small legs, and Lucas had to quicken his pace to keep up with her. During the journey, she remained silent, as if she knew he had many questions, but that this was not the time to answer them. The further they walked, the more Lucas became convinced that this child was part of something bigger, an enigma within the mystery. They walked for nearly half an hour until they reached the edge of a cliff, where the sound of waves crashing on the rocks below echoed in the darkness. The girl stopped abruptly and pointed to a narrow path that led down towards the coast. "It's this way," she said, with the same unsettling serenity as before. Lucas looked at the path, uncertain. The trail seemed dangerous, especially at night, and the sound of the raging sea below did nothing to reassure him. "What will we find there?" he asked, but the girl didn't respond. She just started down the trail, her steps agile and steady, as if she knew the path by heart. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but he knew he had no choice. Clara was somewhere waiting for him, and somehow this mysterious girl seemed to be the only one who knew how to lead him to her. With his heart in his throat and his mind buzzing with questions, Lucas followed the girl down the treacherous trail, descending further and further into the unknown. Lucas followed the girl along the trail, his mind wrapped in a whirlwind of doubts. Every step he took down the narrow and dangerous descent towards the coast seemed to carry the weight of his decision to trust that mysterious child. The sound of waves crashing violently against the rocks echoed in the darkness, reminding him that one false move could lead to his death. The girl, however, advanced with confidence, as if she knew that path like the back of her hand. Lucas tried to keep the pace, but the restlessness inside him only increased. Who was that girl? And why did he seem to know so much about Clara? The wind howled increasingly louder as they approached the end of the trail. When they reached an isolated clearing, hidden between rock formations and crooked trees, Lucas stopped, observing the place. The clearing, on the edge of the cliff, seemed to be isolated from everything, a forgotten spot on the coast that could only be accessed by those who knew the terrain well. The girl stopped next to a larger rock, looked at Lucas and pointed to a narrow, almost invisible entrance between the rocks. "It's here," she said in the same calm, authoritative voice. Lucas felt a mixture of fear and expectation. The entrance seemed to lead to a cave, and he knew in that moment that whatever was inside would bring answers, or perhaps something much darker. Without hesitation, the girl entered first, and Lucas followed closely behind. The cave was dark, damp, and the air inside was thick with a salty metallic smell. Lucas used his cell phone's flashlight to light the way, but the light seemed weak compared to the darkness that surrounded him. As they walked deeper into the cave, the sound of the waves diminished, replaced by an unsettling silence. The heavy atmosphere oppressed him, and he felt as if he were entering a world apart, a dimension where time and space did not follow the same rules. It was as if the cave was some kind of passage, and he was about to cross an important threshold. The tunnel suddenly widened, and Lucas found himself in a larger room, carved out of the natural rock. In the center was a stone table, surrounded by worn candles and objects that looked ancient, almost archaic. A sense of ritual came over him. There were symbols etched into the walls, and Lucas couldn't help but notice the feeling of being watched. The girl stopped next to the table, looking at him with her large, expressionless eyes, as if she was waiting for some reaction from him. "What is that?" Lucas asked, unable to hide the nervousness in his voice. The girl just pointed to an object on the table, a small notebook with a dark cover, very similar to the one he had found in the room of the house in the hills. Lucas approached cautiously, taking the notebook in his hands. When he opened it, he saw that it was written in a familiar handwriting, Clara's. Each page contained detailed notes, explaining everything she had discovered in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Clara was investigating a secret organization that operated in small towns like Fisherman's Bay, using abandoned properties as hideouts and meeting points. She mentioned illegal experiments and the manipulation of people for dark purposes. Between the pages, Lucas found a name that made him freeze: Marcos. He was the leader of the organization, and Clara had discovered that he was connected not only to the city, but also to her own family's history. The last excerpt from the notebook made Lucas' heart race. Clara had planned to meet Marcos in that same cave, the night she disappeared. She knew he was hunting her. She knew she was in danger, but she believed this would be her last chance to expose the whole truth. Lucas read the last words that Clara had written. "If I don't come back, he'll catch me. The cave holds all the secrets. Don't let it silence me." The sentence ended abruptly, as if Clara had been interrupted while writing. Shock took over Lucas. What had happened to her there? Would Clara be alive or dead? Lucas looked around, the weight of the revelations crashing down on him like an avalanche. He knew he was close to something terrible, but he was also close to definitive answers. The girl continued to watch him in silence, as if she knew that the end of that search was about to reveal itself. Lucas now understood that this place held more than secrets. He held the key to Clara's destiny, and, in some way, his own as well. He was about to find out what really happened, and he knew that from that moment on, his life would change forever. The cave seemed to swallow Lucas as he remained there, still, absorbing the contents of Clara's notebook. The revelations he had just read left him in a state of shock and disbelief, but at the same time, they ignited a deep anger within him. Clara had come so close to exposing that shadowy organization, and now it was clear that her life had been in danger from the start. The presence of Marcos, the leader of that clandestine network, and the connection with the city and the house in the hills made everything seem like a carefully planned trap. Clara had been drawn to that place, and Lucas was following the same path. But he wouldn't let it end the same way for him. As he processed everything, the girl took a few steps forward, approaching the cave's exit. "He's coming," she said, her voice soft and firm, without a trace of emotion. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He could only mean one person, Marcos. The girl was there to guide him to that point, but now the real confrontation was about to happen. Lucas closed the notebook and took a deep breath. He knew he needed to be ready to face the man responsible for so much suffering, the man who was most likely behind his wife's disappearance. For the first time in months, he felt closer to Clara, but also closer to danger than he had ever been. Following the girl out of the cave, Lucas was overcome by a sense of urgency. The night was even darker, with the stars hidden by dense clouds, and the sound of the sea, previously distant, now seemed to be intensifying, as if the waves were echoing what was to come. As Lucas stepped out onto the edge of the cliff, he saw a figure approaching along the trail they had come down. He was a tall man, with slow and sure steps, surrounded by a shadow that seemed to distort the darkness around him. The dim light of the moon partially illuminated his face, and Lucas knew immediately that he was facing Marcos, the man who had haunted the last moments of Clara's life. Marcos stopped a few meters away, his eyes fixed on Lucas. The tension between the two was palpable, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and waves crashing against the rocks below. "You've come too far, Lucas," Marcos said in a cool, controlled voice. "But you should have stayed away. This isn't for you." Lucas, however, did not back down. He knew he could no longer allow himself to be a victim of that shadow play. "Where's Clara?" His voice came out steady, even though fear and anger fought inside him. Marcos gave a slight smile, almost contemptuous. "Clara made choices that put her in danger, just like you are doing now." Lucas felt his blood boil in his veins. He knew that Marcos was playing with his emotions, trying to destabilize him. But now, with all the pieces starting to fall into place, he wouldn't let fear control him. "You are involved in something much bigger than you can control," Marcos continued, walking slowly towards the edge of the cliff, without looking away from Lucas. "All of this, BP, the house, Clara, is part of a cycle that was already in motion long before you realized it." Lucas took a step forward, anger now gripping every fiber of his body. "Where is she?" he repeated, this time with more urgency. It was then that Marcos stopped, looking at Lucas with a mix of curiosity and arrogance. "She's where she's always been, trapped by her own choices," he replied cryptically. Lucas, unable to control the fury rising within him, charged forward with determination. "No more games, Marcos. Where is Clara? What did you do with her?" Before Marcos could respond, the sound of a car quickly approaching interrupted them. Lucas looked back and saw headlights shining in the distance. That was the time to act. He knew that if he didn't find out the truth now, he could lose Clara forever. But before he could take any action, something surprising happened. The girl, who until then had been observing the scene in silence, took a step forward, positioning herself between Marcos and Lucas. "She's alive," said the girl, looking directly at Lucas, as if she were revealing a secret that would change everything. "But he's the key. Only you can save her." The impact of those words made time seem to slow down. Lucas realized that this was his last chance, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to save Clara. Without thinking twice, Lucas advanced towards Marcos, adrenaline burning through his veins. The fight that followed was intense, fast, and full of fury. Each blow was driven by the accumulated pain of months of searching, by the fear of never seeing Clara again, and by the determination to take down the man who had caused so much suffering. In the end, Lucas, despite being injured, managed to knock Marcos down, leaving him unconscious on the edge of the cliff. Panting, he looked at the girl, who now looked less like a child and more like a guardian of that destiny. She guided him to a place where Clara was hiding, weak but alive. Lucas found her tied up, but still conscious, as if she had been waiting for that moment for months. He released her, and as he hugged her, silent tears ran down his face. They had won, but they knew that the fight to leave everything behind was just beginning. However, at that moment when he felt Clara in his arms again, Lucas knew that, somehow, they had survived the worst. And now, together, they would face what was to come.